This course section will be about forms and handling user input. Now, this might sound trivial, but once you take a closer look, you will see that A, a lot of web applications out there are all about forms. You are fetching user input basically everywhere if you take a closer look. And B, that can be more difficult than it first seems, especially providing feedback to the user. So making the user aware of some invalid input value and so on. All of that can be quite complex, especially, of course, if you want to get it right and provide a good user experience. Therefore, this course section is all about that. And we're not going to learn new React features, but we are instead going to apply what we learned over this entire course up to this point to build forms that feel great from a user experience and still have code that we can manage as a developer. Therefore, we'll first of all explore what exactly is complex about forms. We're then going to dive into how we may handle form input values and validation and forms overall with React. And we're also going to have a look at some tools and approaches that can make our life easier as a developer, because you will see that there is more complexity inherent to this concept than you maybe might have thought at first. Now, for this course section, attached you find a starting project which you can download, extract, and then run npm install in the extracted folder to install all the dependencies this project needs, and then npm start to start up that development server. And once you do that, you'll be greeted with this basic form, with this basic input. And that's what we're going to get started with. It's this simple input component which you're seeing. We also have a basic form component, at which we'll take a look later, but we're going to start with this simple input. And that is just a regular React component, returning some JSX, to be precise, returning a form element, a form tag, and then one form input in there with a label and a button. Now, this course section will not be about how to write forms when it comes to HTML. So we're not going to dive into which HTML elements you could use, and we're not going to talk about accessibility here. We're also not going to dive into styling. I provide some basic styling here for you in this index.css file, which gives us this look here. But beyond that, it's up to you to, of course, style this and structure this however you want. In this course section, I really want to focus on React and what we do with React when it comes to forms. Because after all, this is a React course. So what's difficult about forms though? Forms might seem simple and trivial, but they are not. Forms can actually be complex from a developer's point of view, because forms and their inputs can assume a broad variety of different states. One or more inputs could be invalid or valid. And these are only two states. It's even possible that you could have forms where the state is unknown, because maybe you have some asynchronous validation where you need to send a request to a server behind the scenes to check something to find out if a certain value is available, let's say an email address, to then find out whether the input is valid or not. So it could be even more complex than shown here, but even here we have two states. And you must not forget that these states, valid and invalid, don't just apply to the overall form, but to every individual input in the form. And it's then the sum of the states of those inputs that make up the overall form state. Now, when a form and its inputs are invalid, you might want to output input-specific error messages and highlight the problematic inputs. And you also want to ensure that the form can't be submitted or saved if one or more inputs are invalid. If the inputs are valid, though, you of course want to make sure that it can be submitted and saved. Now, when we dive into showing error messages and highlighting invalid inputs, things get even more complex. Because the question then is when to validate. when should you check the user input? You can validate the user input when the form is submitted as a whole. You can also check the value entered by a user once an input loses focus, to then check what the user did enter there and find out if it is valid. And you can, of course, also do that on every keystroke or on every change the user makes to an input. Now, when you validate once the form is submitted as a whole, you, of course, allow the user to enter a valid value before possibly warning him or her. That means if the user starts typing in, let's say, the email field, you don't tell the user that the entered email address is wrong before the user even had a chance of entering one. So that's good. You wait until the user is done, and then you possibly show an error. So this avoids unnecessary warnings, but as a downside, the feedback might come a little bit too late. If I press submit, and you then tell me that something's wrong, I have to go back to that input where something was wrong and enter my value again. It's not the end of the world, but maybe not the final user experience we might want to offer. Now, when we validate an input when it loses focus, the good thing also is that we allow the user to enter a valid value before warning him or her, just as when we waited for the overall form. But we already do show an error then once the user is done with that specific input. So we don't wait for the overall form submission, but we just wait until the user is done with one specific input. This can be very useful for untouched forms, so where the user hasn't entered anything yet. The downside with this approach, however, if you only validate on losing focus, is that if an input was invalid, so if the user did already enter something invalid and now comes back to fix it, you don't tell the user if it's now valid or not until he or she is done entering an input. That's where on-keystroke validation might be better. There you provide direct feedback to the user on whether the input is valid or not on every keystroke. But as a downside, you here warn the user before he or she even had a chance of entering valid values. So if you visit a forum for the first time and you haven't entered anything, you would be greeted with tons of errors if we only validate on keystroke, because initially everything is invalid, of course, and we haven't given the user any chance of entering anything valid. If, on the other hand, we combine this with the other methods somehow, and we only validate on keystroke if the input was invalid before, then we can provide direct feedback and therefore tell the user once the input is valid. And if this is all a little abstract, that's no problem. We're now going to explore these different approaches in great detail in this module, and we're going to see how things behave and how we can fine-tune this to come up with the best possible solution. Now, for all of that, let's come back to this simple input component. And let's start with getting the user input here. And let's then also validate that input and potentially show an error message to the user. And then we're going to explore the different ways of validating, so the different triggers for validating, to find out where the differences are and how we might best be able to combine everything. So let's start with fetching the entered value, the user input. And there are two main ways for doing that. We can listen on every keystroke and store the value in some state variable, so to say. Or we use a ref to fetch the input once the user is done typing in a value. And I'll show both here. Of course, in reality, you would only use one of the two approaches. But here I'll use both, and hence I will import use ref and use state from React. And then here we'll start with state. I can set up a new state, my entered name, let's say, by calling use state, and initially it's an empty string. And then we can update this entered name with set entered name on every keystroke or on every change that occurs here on this input element. So here we can add a name input change handler, such a function, which receives the default event object. That's how JavaScript in the browser behaves. Once we bind this function to the onChange event on the input, we automatically get an event object describing the event, and from there we can get the entered value. And therefore, we'll be able to set the entered name to event.target.value. And that's vanilla JavaScript, that we have access to this entered value on the event target, which will be this input. And event target will be this input because we can now bind the name input change handler here to the onChange event, so that on every keystroke this is fired, and hence the entered name state is updated. Then we can add a second function here, the form submission handler, and this, as the name implies, is triggered once the form is submitted. And there we also will get an event object, because I'll bind this function to onSubmit on this form, like this. Now here's one very important thing here you have to watch out for, and that is that on event, you should call prevent default here. Because again, we're dealing with some vanilla JavaScript and browser behavior, and the default behavior by the browser is that if a form is submitted with a button inside of a form, a HTTP request is sent to the server serving this website. That happens automatically. The browser does this automatically. It sends an HTTP request to the server which is serving this website. The problem with that is that here we don't really have a server that wants to do anything with that request. We just have a static server that serves our JavaScript and HTML files. So we don't want this request to be sent. And hence on this event object, which we get automatically passed into this function since we bound it to onSubmit, on this event object, we can call prevent default to tell the browser to not do that default behavior, to not send this HTTP request, and instead to do nothing. And we need to do that because if that HTTP request would be sent, it would lead to the page being reloaded in the end, and we definitely don't want that, because that would restart the entire React application, we would lose all our state, and we would definitely not have the behavior we want. So that's important. Then as a next step, now that we can guarantee that the page won't be reloaded and the app won't be restarted, we can console log the entered name. So the last name we stored because of our input change handler. And if we now save that all, and I go to my console here, I can type Maximilian here, and if I hit submit, that gets logged to the console. Now the alternative approach would have been to just set a ref on the input and read the value from the input when we need it. So since I'm importing useRef, we can implement this by adding a name input ref constant, for example, and assigning the value of calling useRef to it. And then we set name input ref as a ref to this input with the special ref prop, which React allows us to set on any HTML element. And here I then set name input ref as a ref. And now with that ref set up, when the form is submitted, we could have also gotten this entered value by reaching out to the name input ref and accessing current. On React refs, you always have a current property because refs are always objects with a current property, and it's this current property which then holds the value you assigned to this ref. So in this case, a pointer at this input element, that would be stored in current. So since the value in current is that pointer at the input element, we can also access .value here, because input elements in JavaScript, the JavaScript objects representing these HTML input elements, always have a value property which holds the value currently entered in that input. So that's how we can read that entered value from that input. And we can store this in entered value and then simply output this here. And if I do that and I reload and I type max, we see max twice. The first output is coming from our state, the second output from our ref. Now, in reality, you of course wouldn't do both. You would do one of the two approaches, either every keystroke logging with the state or something similar, or you use a ref to read the value when you need it. Now, how do you decide which one to use? It depends what you plan to do with the entered value. If you are only interested in it once when the form is submitted, a ref might be better, because logging and updating the state value with every keystroke is a bit overkill then. You don't need to do that if you only want the value once. However, if you of course need the value, the entered value, after every keystroke, for example for instant validation, then using the state is better, because with a ref you can't really do that. Another reason for using a state instead of a ref could be if you want to reset the entered input. Let's say here at the end of the form submission handler. There we can reset the entered name by calling set entered name and setting this to an empty string. And all we now need to do is bind the entered value back to the input through the value prop. The entered name is now bound to the value prop on input, and hence if we update the entered name, that will be reflected here. This works great when using state, but it's not really possible with refs, at least not as elegant. With refs, you could also use your ref and access the input element, which is stored in that ref, and set value equal to an empty string. But this is not an ideal way of doing it. It works, if I comment out this. It works, as you can tell, but it's not ideal because we are directly manipulating the DOM here. We're using some vanilla JavaScript code to directly reach out to the DOM and change something there, and that is typically not something you should do. You should leave that up to React. React should be the only thing manipulating the DOM, and therefore this is not ideal. Don't manipulate the DOM. You can do it, and it might be okay. It's up to you ultimately, but it's not a very clean way of using React. So that could be another reason for using state, which you potentially update on every keystroke, because maybe you want to reset the entered value. But that's not even the main topic of this module. Now we know how we can get the entered value and when we might want to get it. But this module is about more than that. It is mainly also about validation. And that's something I want to dive in next. How can we validate this user input, and how do we best do that? So in this input here, we might want to add some validation, so that, for example, I can't submit this form when the input is empty, because then I would get 2 empty logs here, and whilst we only have logs here, in most cases we would probably send that data to a server, and we don't want to send empty data to the server. Though I also already want to say, the client-side validation which we're doing here, where we validate in the browser, isn't everything you should be doing. If you have a real website, a real web application which you're building, then validating in the browser, as we are about to add it here, is great for the user experience, because you give the user a direct feedback. But you also always should validate the input on the server, because this code here on the browser, this can all be edited by your users. I can dive into the source code and change this raw JavaScript code. So this is not reliable. It's just there for providing a good user experience. It's not a security mechanism or anything like that. And I have an article and video on that, which you'll find attached, which also might be helpful when it comes to JavaScript in the browser and the security implications of doing things in JavaScript in the browser. But that's a side note. Let's come back to how we could validate this. How could we make sure that we, for example, show an error and don't log the values to the console if we try to submit an empty field? Well, of course, we can go to the form submission handler, and there we can add a if check. Here we can add a if check, and we can then simply check if the entered name, and here I'll go with that state value now, if that entered name is empty maybe. We also might want to call trim on that entered name string to remove any excess white space at the beginning and end. Now, of course, the exact validation logic you need depends on the form input value you are expecting. If it's just some name, you might be fine with just checking that it's not empty. For an email address, you might want to validate that it's a valid email. But I want to keep it simple here, so I'm just checking for it being empty or not. Now, if it is empty, if we have an empty string here, then I don't want to continue with the next lines of code. Because here we are using the entered value, and I don't want to do that if that value is empty. Hence here, I want to return, which returns from this overall function and therefore cancels the function execution. Now, the rest of this function will not be executed. So if we save this, and I reload to clear my log, if I now hit submit here, you see nothing gets added here. Not even empty console logs. There's nothing here. If I do enter something though, we still see that. So that's working. But what we're not doing is we're not showing the user feedback. We're not showing the user that something went wrong. Of course, users don't have the developer tools open, so if I'm a user visiting this page and I click submit, I don't know if anything happened or if my input here is invalid. I might be able to guess that an empty input is invalid, but I get no feedback from the app. So that's why we might want to show some error feedback. And we can, of course, implement such a functionality with React as well. To add some basic validation, we can manage more state. We can add a entered name is valid state and a set entered name is valid state updating function, which we get from use state. And here we now want to start with false, so that initially the entered name is not valid. And we can then set this to true if the entered name is valid. So therefore, here in the form submission handler, if the input is invalid, then I want to set entered name is valid to false, because it is not valid here. If we make it past this if check, we can set entered name is valid to true, because if we make it past this if check, the value is valid. And now we could use entered name is valid to show an error message. Here, below this input, inside this form control div, we could add a paragraph where we, for example, say name must not be empty. And I only want to show this paragraph if entered name is valid is false, so if it's not valid. Now we of course learned how we can show content conditionally in React, and hence here we can apply what we learned. We can check if not, hence the exclamation mark, entered name is valid, and if that's the case, we output this paragraph, otherwise we don't do anything. And we can give this paragraph a class name of error text, because that's one of the predefined CSS classes I added here in index CSS for some basic styling. With that, I get this error. But now I also get this error before I even start typing. So maybe we instead want to start with setting this to true initially, so that entered name is valid is true initially. With that, if I save here, we don't see the error message initially, but if I click submit, it now shows up. So this would be one way of adding basic validation to this form and of making sure that we give the user some feedback if things go wrong. Now I actually prepared more validation feedback which we can add, and that affects this CSS class which is added on that div, that form control class. I'm not using CSS modules here, but old school CSS classes which are set up globally and then simply used here. I did prepare a special invalid CSS class which affects the input look, and therefore I want to swap form control for form control and invalid if this input is invalid. So here I could add a const name input classes, and that depends on whether the entered name is valid. If that's true, then I want to add just form control as a class. Otherwise, I want to add form-control and invalid as classes. And now class name here is dynamic and points at name input classes. Name input classes. So these classes which we're deriving here. And with that, if I save this, if I reload, we got this look. If I submit this empty form, I get this look, which looks a bit better. Now that is some perfectly fine validation which we could add, but it has some downsides at which I now want to take a closer look. One downside of the validation we added thus far is our code, specifically this line. We have this entered name is valid state, and we start with true here, which implies that initially we treat this as valid. And it turns out that that's not really the case. We just set it to true to not show this error state here ahead of time. But actually we're cheating a bit here. We're setting this state to a value that's not correct because we know that we're not going to really need that state for anything else than outputting whether this is valid or not. Now, why could this be a problem? Well, imagine you had some useEffect call in there where you do something whenever entered name is valid changes, and specifically you do something if entered name is valid is true. So if it's true, you want to do something. You want to, in this case, log name input is valid. In a real application, you might want to send an HTTP request here. So let's say we add this, and for this I import useEffect. If I do that and open the developer tools, you see that this gets logged right at the beginning before I did anything. Because of what I just explained, we incorrectly set this state here to true. And it isn't valid at the beginning. That's just not correct. We just did this as a workaround to correctly show the error feedback. Now, if you don't have this useEffect case here, you of course might be good with that, because then you have no real disadvantage of using this trick. But even then, I don't think this code reads nicely. Entered name is valid is true? Really? At the beginning? It might be nitpicking, but I'm not too happy with that. I think it makes more sense to set this to false initially, because the input is invalid initially. Hence, we might want to add a third state here, the entered name touched state maybe, and set entered name touched, where we basically control whether the user already did edit the entered name input field. And this also is false initially, because initially this input field is untouched. The user didn't do anything with it. So now we can use entered name touched in combination with entered name is valid to show this error message and to add this invalid class. Because now we don't just care about whether the input is invalid or not, but we also care about whether the user had a chance of editing it. Because if the user didn't have a chance yet, because the user didn't touch any input yet, then of course there is no reason to present this error. For this, I'll add a new constant here. Name input is invalid. And for this, I'll check if not entered name is valid. So that's the check we also have down there. But I'll combine this with checking if entered name touched is true. Because only if it was touched and it then is invalid, I want to treat it as invalid. And now it's this name input is invalid boolean, which I can use in this condition here and also down here. Though now we have to be careful, since this is now name input is invalid, we of course need to invert our logic here. Here we don't check if it's not invalid, but if it is invalid. Hence I removed the exclamation mark. And here I of course wanna set this invalid class if name input is invalid and not set it otherwise, like this. With that, if we go back and we reload, initially this is not showing this error state, but if I click submit, it's also not doing that. And of course it's not doing that because we never changed this touched state. We now need to do that. And it's now up to us how we want to change this. And one change definitely is the form submission. If the form is submitted, all inputs are treated as touched. Even if the user didn't type into them, the user submitted the overall form, which basically means the user confirms the overall form. So we could treat all inputs as touched in this case. So whenever the form is submitted, before checking the validity, just when it's submitted, I'll set entered name touched to true. Because all the inputs, and in this case we just have one input, are touched, are confirmed by the user when the form is submitted. With this added, if we now click submit, we get this error state once we submit. And this is now a little bit of a better code. It's more code arguably, but it's cleaner, and it allows us to handle more use cases, and it also allows us to ensure that code like this here works correctly and doesn't run unexpectedly just because of some strange workaround. Now, up to this point, we're still on the left side of this slide. We are always validating when a form is submitted. We're not validating when an input lost focus or on every keystroke. Now, of course, that could be fine. That could be exactly the behavior you want. But let's now explore why we still might want to tweak that behavior in regards to certain aspects. We have the entered name is valid state, the entered name value state, so to say, and the entered name touch state. And still, this behavior isn't fully there where I want it to be. It's good that on submission it now shows us this error, but for example, it doesn't show us an error if I click in there, maybe type something, but then remove everything and click out of there. We know that this is invalid because an empty input is not allowed, but we only show the user this error message when submit is clicked. And that might be too late. That might not be the best possible user experience. I think it's better to show the user this error when the user had a chance of working on this. So if I click in there and click out of there and I leave it empty, I want to see that error that tells me that this is then not allowed. Because I had a chance of editing it, I didn't do that, now I should probably get that error that tells me, hey, you need to enter something here. So therefore, we might want to also validate on blur, as it's called, which means when the input loses focus. And that's not too difficult. Besides the onChange handler, we can also add the onBlur handler. And that's a built-in event which fires whenever this input loses focus. Hence, we can add a new function here. Let's say the name input blur handler, where we also get the default event. And then I want to bind this name input blur handler to my input here. Now in the name input blur handler, I want to do two things. For one, I want to set entered name touched to true, because if an input loses focus, it definitely was touched. The user had a chance of working on it. But in addition, we might want to start validation here. So we might want to run this logic again. So we can copy this code here and add that in the name input blur handler, so that we check the entered name, which we update with every keystroke still, and we set entered name is valid false if that name is invalid. Now we do have code duplication here, And we'll take care about that in a second, but for the moment, let's take this approach here. Let's duplicate the code. It's fine for a second. So now with that, if I click in there and click out of there, I also get my warning here, which I would say is a better user experience. But now we maybe want to give the user a chance of fixing this error. And if I now start typing here, it would be great if this error disappears as soon as I entered a valid value, so that I as a user know once I did reach a valid value, once I can stop typing, for example. And that's why we also might want to validate on every keystroke now, but only in combination with the other validation steps we integrated before. Because just validating on every keystroke alone would probably not be good. We would be throwing errors at users without them having a chance of providing something valid first. But now that we do actually allow the user to provide a valid value first by listening to the lost focus and the form submission, now that we're doing that, we also want to give the user a chance of getting immediate feedback, direct feedback on every keystroke when it comes to fixing that invalid value. So that's what we're going to do now. So now I also want to validate on every keystroke. Hence, we can also copy this validation logic to the name input change handler. But actually, doing it like that would be incorrect, because here we check if it's not valid and set this to not valid if it is. But actually, of course, I want to check if it is valid on every keystroke to get rid of that validation error as quickly as possible. Hence, here, I want to check if it's not equal to an empty string and then set entered name is valid to true. And we don't need to return here, by the way, because there is no code to execute after the if statement. The same here in the blur handler. We can get rid of return there. So now in name input change handler, we are validating the input. We are setting this to true as soon as we do detect a valid input. Though here, as a side note, we shouldn't use the entered name state, but instead event target value. Because we do update the entered name state with this line, but as you learned, such state updates are then scheduled by React. They are not processed immediately, so in the next line thereafter, you don't have that latest state yet. Hence here, you would be referring to an old state if you used entered name. So therefore, instead of doing that, we should use the same state data source we used for updating the state in the line before, which is the event target value here. Now with that, if we save this, if we start typing here, with every keystroke, we update this. So now we might have the best possible solution here. Now we get this instant validation once it blurs or once we submit. But then if we have an error, so if we do, for example, blur with an invalid value, we do give immediate feedback and allow the user to directly fix this with every keystroke. And I think this is a rather good user experience. What's not so good, though, is our code, because we wrote a lot of code for just one input. Now, there will be ways of reusing logic, and I'll come back to those, but I want to start with cleaning up that code here a bit, because that is definitely not the code we want to write to achieve this behavior. So what's problematic about this code? Well, we have a lot of repetition, and we have a lot of code in general just to handle this, and it just doesn't feel like the shortest possible way of writing this. And indeed, it isn't. Now, of course, one tiny piece of code we can get rid of is that code here where I use my input ref. Because I am using state here to get the value, there is no need to keep the input ref around. But that's just a small thing. I will nonetheless remove it. But that's not the main thing I want to change. Though here I will therefore also delete name input ref, remove the use ref import, and down in the JSX code, remove this ref assignment. But again, that was not the main thing. The main thing instead is this general validation logic with all those different event handler functions and what they're doing. I think it doesn't have to be that complex. In the end, we must not forget that it is all about finding out whether the input is valid and if it was touched. And if it's invalid and was touched, we want to show the user an error. Otherwise, we don't want to do that. Since that is the goal, we actually don't necessarily have to manage a separate entered name is valid state. Instead, let me get rid of that dummy useFact call. We don't need it here. Instead, we could add a derived entered name is valid constant here and get rid of that state here and just work with the value and the touched state. Because entered name is valid is simply something we can derive from the entered name state. And since this entire component function will re-execute whenever a new value is entered, we ensure that this constant will always take into account the latest value and touched state. Because whenever one of these two states changes, this component function gets re-rendered. So here in entered name is valid, I want to store the result of checking entered name, so this entered name state here, dot trim being equal or not equal to an empty string. Because this is entered name is valid, and that should be true if this here yields true. If the trimmed entered name is not empty, then entered name is valid. This means that we can get rid of all the parts of the code where we set entered name is valid, because deriving this result from the already existing states like this is enough. And here I do set entered name, hence we ensure that the component function gets re-rendered and gets re-evaluated on every keystroke, which is exactly what we want here. Now what about this name input blur handler? Well, in the end here, I also don't need to validate this. Instead, we can delete this and we can rely on this inferred state combined with this inferred value down there. Name input is invalid, which takes this inferred constant into account. The entered name is valid, which is based on the entered name value, and combines that with entered name touched. And to make this a bit easier, I'll move that constant right below entered name is valid. So these two lines of code now work together. We first find out if the entered name was valid, and we then check if it's not valid and combine that information with entered name touched. So now we still get these values, but we have to manage one state slice less. We don't have to manage the state validity. Now in the form submission handler, we of course still want to keep this if check around though to cancel the form submission if the input is invalid. But here we don't need to set the validity. Instead here we can simply check if entered name is valid is false. So this inferred variable, if that's false. If it's not valid, I want to return. I can do this here because this function, this form submission function, this handler function, also gets recreated when the component function is re-evaluated. So this form submission handler function will have access to that latest inferred entered name is valid value here. And here where I then set entered name is valid to true, that is also not needed here because we got all the code related to that which we need already in place. Now, with all of that, if we give this a try and reload, if I submit, we still see that it's invalid. If I click in there and out of there, we see this. If I enter something, this behaves correctly. But if I then submit, if I submit a correct value, it jumps back to showing me that this is invalid. And that's not a bug, but simply a result from the code we wrote here, where we set entered name to an empty string, and that indeed does result in entered name being not valid. But the fix is simple. We just also want to reset the touched state once we submit a form. So after set entered name, and setting this back to an empty string, I want to set entered name touched back to false to reset the touch state. Because once the form is submitted, it of course should again act as if it wasn't touched at all, because it's a brand new form now in the end. So if we add this and then go back, now if I submit this form, it's not showing me the error again. And we now definitely slimmed down that code and have a way more readable and manageable code. And I know that it took quite a lot of steps to get there, but I wanted to make it clear what the thought process is here and why we are doing it like that. And let me get rid of that useEffect import, which we don't need anymore. With that, we have a relatively lean component here, which manages the input value and the touch state, and then derives the validity from those states. So I'm happy with my form behavior here, or with the behavior of this input, but there's one thing which we must not forget. This is one input of an overall form, and in this case, of course, it's the only input. But often you would have more than one input, as we're also soon going to see in the basic form JavaScript file. And for such scenarios, of course, it would be good if we also could find out if the overall form is valid. In the one input case, the overall form is always valid if the one input is valid. But if it's a form with multiple inputs, that's of course not the case. Then 3 of 4 inputs might be valid, 1 input might be invalid, and the overall form then also would be invalid. Because the overall form is only valid if all form inputs are valid. And as soon as at least one form input is invalid, the overall form is invalid. And that's therefore something we should take into account and also incorporate into our logic. But how can we do that now? Well, here's one way of doing that. We can add a new state, which is form is valid, and it has a setFormIsValid state updating function. And initially that's false, because initially that form isn't valid. Now I want to update this overall formIsValid updating function whenever one of the form inputs changes. And for that we could again use useEffect. So I'll bring back that import, and I'll then add a useEffect call here below those 2 constants here. And in this useEffect call here, I want to set the overall form validity. For this, I'm interested in the validity of my form inputs, and hence I'll add all the form input validities I have in this form here. So for example, the entered name is valid, constant. If we had 2 form inputs here, we would have another constant. For example, for the entered age is valid. And then I would enter entered age as is valid as another dependency here. But we don't have that here, hence it's only one entry. Now that's the dependency of useEffect, and as you learned, whenever the value in such a dependency changes, this effect runs again. And it also runs for the very first time this component is evaluated. So in this useEffect call, I then basically want to combine all my dependencies and check if they are all valid, and if they are, I want to set the overall form to valid. So here I'll check if entered name is valid, and I would add other validities if we had them, like entered age is valid, and check if that's true as well, but we don't have that here. And if it is valid, then I'll set my overall form as valid. Else, if at least one of my inputs is invalid, I'll set my overall form to invalid. So I'll set formIsValid to false. And then we could use this value as well. For example, if we wanted to disable this button. Here we could set disabled equal to not form is valid. So the button is disabled if the form is not valid. Now for this, I'll quickly add a style for this. So on the button here, I'll just set a disabled style, which also should apply if the button is then hovered or set as active. And I'll simply add a background color of a light gray here, and a text color of a slightly darker gray, like this, and a border color of that light gray as well. And I'll set the cursor to not allowed. But that's just some CSS styling for this. With that added though, and with disabled being set, you see this button is disabled at the start. It also stays disabled, but if I enter at least one valid character, it becomes enabled. If I invalidate again, it's now disabled again. Now also the form can't even be submitted anymore if it's invalid. Now it's up to you whether you want to disable the button or not. You'll find opinions in both directions out there in the web. There are also people which argue that you should allow your users to submit an invalid form, to not restrict them without them knowing what they have to enter, but that is up to you. I just want to show you how you could build something like this and how you could manage the overall form validity in addition to the validity of the individual inputs, because that can also matter. Of course, if we take a closer look at this useEffect function here though, we don't even need useEffect. We're not performing any side effect in there. We're doing nothing that would be a problem if we would do it without using useEffect. All we're doing is deriving a new value, just as we're already doing it in lines 7 and 8 with entered name is valid and name input is invalid. So we're basically doing the same here, just for deriving the overall form validity. And of course there is no reason to use useEffect here for that. We can, but it really doesn't add anything, it just adds extra component re-evaluation cycles. And that's of course not an advantage. Instead, we can get rid of that form is valid state, and we can get rid of useEffect, and just check if entered name is valid, and any other properties we might have here, like entered age if we had that. And then we simply add a new variable here, form is valid, which by default is false, let's say, which we then set to true here in this if case, and which we set to false here in the else case. And actually we don't even need the else case now, because that is our default. And we only override this with true if all our input states are valid. So this again allows us to slim this down even further. And I'm showing this because thinking about possibilities like this is also worth it and is a good thing to do, because it allows you to write slimmer code and maybe even more performant code. So with that, we still got the same behavior as before, but now with less code. So as mentioned at the end of last lecture, we have a working code here, but we have a lot of duplication. We're not duplicating the exact same words. These constants are named differently. This logic here is different. But the overall logic, the overall structure is of course exactly the same. And if we think about a more complex form like this one, which actually isn't too complex, but which has at least 3 inputs, then we would be repeating that same structure, that same code in the end, 3 times. And that's not what we want to do. So instead, we typically want to outsource some logic somewhere. We don't want to retype and repeat it all the time. And how can we best do that? You could consider creating a separate input component so that you replace this code down there with the input component, and inside of that input component, you then have that logic for validating it, for checking its touch status, and so on. And that would probably work. That is something you could do. The only thing that could become a bit more tricky then, or where you would need to find a solution, would be for managing the overall form validity. Because if you manage every input as an individual closed thing, and you know if the input is valid or not, you then also need a way of letting the overall form know if it's valid or not. And that could certainly be done with props and passing functions to props and calling them from inside the input component and so on. But there also is another approach which I tend to prefer here. And that would be a custom hook. we can use a custom hook to manage all that state logic in there. And let me show you how we could do that. For this, I'll add a new folder in this project here. I'll name it hooks next to components. And I'll then add a useinput.js file because it will be a hook for managing the state and the logic for an input. So in here, I'll add my useinput hook function, and I will export it as a default here. And now in this hook function, I want to manage the value of a given input, the touched state. I want to infer its validity, also combined, of course, with the touched state. Now, of course, this hook should then also be flexible, though. The concrete validation logic should be passed into the hook from outside. But that is something we can build. And I'll start by copying the entered name and entered name touched states here and add them in the useinput function. For this, of course, here in this useinput.js file, we need to import useState from React. Then I'll rename this here to entered value and set entered value to make it more generic. And that here is touched and set is touched. Now, as a next step, we can copy our inferred state here, so to say. So these two constants, entered name is valid and name input is invalid. I'll copy those and also give those better names. I'll name the first one value is valid, and the second one could get a name of has error, because in the end here we control whether an error should be shown or not. Now for value is valid, I check the entered value here, and for has error, I then use value is valid, and if it's not valid, combined with is touched, I find out whether we want to show an error or not. Now this validation logic, however, shouldn't be hard-coded here. Instead, I want to get the logic for that from outside, where this hook gets used. But that's no problem. We can expect a function as an argument to this custom hook function. Let's say the validate value function. So I expect that this parameter receives a function as a value. So that here, for value is valid, I can execute validate value and just pass in the entered value we currently have. And then this hook could return something. It could return an object, could also be an array, but one of the two because I want to return more than one thing. And in this object, I'll return the value, which is the entered value. I'll return has error, which holds the result stored in has error. And since we got the same names here, we can use the modern JavaScript syntax of just listing this once, and it'll automatically be expanded to this here behind the scenes. And we will also need a way of letting the component that uses this hook set the entered value and set the touched state thereafter. Now, for that, we could go back to simple input and copy the name input change handler into useinput as a function, and copy the name input blur handler into our hook function, and rename the functions to value change handler and call set entered value here, and then also input blur handler and call set is touched here. And when we return, I want to expose those functions. So I'll expose the value change handler and the input blur handler, so that these functions, which are defined in the hook, can be called from the place where the hook is being used. So can be called from the component that uses that hook. Now with that, we can use this custom hook in the simple input component. There, we can now import use input from, going up one level, hooks use input, and then call use input here, and then extract values from the result returned by use input. Use input returns such an object, Hence, we can use object destructuring to pull out those keys from that returned object and store the values in brand new constants. So we can, for example, extract the value and then also assign an alias with the colon here and name this entered name, and also pull out the has error state and maybe name this name input has error. Those aliases, of course, are up to you. And also extract the value change handler and give this an alias of name changed handler, and get access to the input blur handler and give it an alias of name blur handler or something like this. So that this is how we use the hook. But we also need to pass a value into the hook, and that's this validate value function which we call here. So for this we could define an inline function here where we get some value and then return the result of calling trim on that value and comparing it with an empty string. So the logic we have down there, just with value instead of entered name. Now this is an anonymous arrow function, which is not executed here, but defined here in line, which is then passed to use input. So it's received on this validate value parameter. And then this function here, which we define here, is actually executed in this line here. That's where it's being called. And the entered value, which is this state we're managing here, is the value passed into this function. Can be a bit tricky to wrap your head around, but in the end, it's just regular JavaScript where we are passing a function as a value to another function. And with that, we can customize the validation logic in the component where we need this hook and still execute it inside of the hook. And that now allows us to get rid of these two state slices here for the entered name. It allows us to get rid of these two constants here. Entered name is valid and name input is invalid. And instead use these pulled out constants here. And for example, here we are then actually missing information about the validity. We know if there is an error or not, but that's not just the validity, but the validity combined with the touched state. And therefore, to expose just the validity of an input to the component, I will actually also return value is valid here. Maybe on a is valid key, so that we also expose that information from the hook to the component where we use it. And then in the component, we can also extract is valid and store this in a entered name is valid constant by assigning this alias. And then entered name is valid can be used here again. Now we can get rid of the name input change handler function here and of the name input blur handler. And instead we'll use the name changed handler and the name blur handler, which we're getting out of the hook. So down there in JSX, I connect the name change handler and the name blur handler. Here, instead of using name input is invalid, I will use name has error, name input has error, which we're also getting from the custom hook. And then here, for the form submission handler, where I want to change the touch status and where I want to reset the form, we can get rid of this line of code because the form can't be submitted if the inputs are invalid anyways. So we don't need to mark the inputs as touched here. But of course, we want to be able to reset the form, and therefore we can go back to the custom hook and add a third function here, a reset function, where we simply call set entered value and set this to an empty string, and set is touched and set this to false. And then we just need to expose that so that we also return the reset function as a value in a reset key in that overall returned object. And in simple input.js, we can then get access to this reset function and maybe name it reset name input, give it this alias, And in the form submission handler, we can then just call reset name input here. Now down there, where we infer the CSS classes, I now want to use the name input has error data piece, which we get from the hook. And with that, if we reload, this name behaves just like before. And the overall form also behaves just like before. If I enter something valid here, we can submit it. If this is invalid, we can't. If I reload, if I click in there and out of there, it's invalid. This all works like before, but now with a custom hook. And now we can therefore also replace the email state, the entered email state, with our custom hook. Feel free to try this on your own. We're going to do it together in the next lecture. So let's now also use the custom hook for the entered email. For this, I'll call useInput here. And we get back this object with all that data we can pull out and use here. For example, the value, which I'll assign to a entered email alias. The isValid value, which I'll assign to an entered email isValid alias. We'll get hasError, which I'll assign to the email input hasError alias. And reformat this to make it easier to read. We'll get the value change handler, which I'll assign to email change handler. And the same for the input blur handler, which I assign to email blur handler. And then reset, which I'll assign to reset email input. We also need to pass in our validation function, and hence I'll grab this logic. And then again, define a function here, inline, which gets a value, which will be passed in from inside the hook, where I then return the result of calling includes at on this value. This determines whether this is valid or not. With that, I can get rid of these two lines of code. We can get rid of these two lines of code here. And then here, for the overall form validity, we already are using entered email is valid, so that works. We can get rid of the email input change handler and the email input blur handlers. Here in the form submission handler, we also, of course, want to reset the email input. And then here, I want to use the email input hasError field to determine the CSS classes. And if we scroll down to the JSX code, here I want to use the email change handler and the email blur handler and the email input hasError field here. And with that, we're using this hook for the email input as well. We can also get rid of the use state import now, because here I'm now not using use state anymore. And with that again, if I reload here, this both behaves as it did before, but now with less code duplication here. Now we have a working code here with help of our custom hook, which we can call and pull out the values which we need, where all the logic then resides inside of that hook, and hence our component can stay a bit leaner and can focus mostly on the JSX, on validating the overall form, which is fairly simple, and on handling the form submission. Now, again, let's practice what we learned. We have this basic form component here. Let's go to app.js and swap this simple input here for the basic form component. And of course, therefore also add the import here to basic form from /components basic form, so that if we save that, we got this form. Now, this is still a form, still not too fancy, but it of course now has 3 inputs instead of 2, and it's a brand new form without any validation at all. And I now want you to again apply what we learned, if possible, of course, without looking at simple input, at least not in great detail. And use our custom hook here, or if you're feeling super fancy, try building up that custom hook from scratch again, to again practice what we did over the last lectures. So start with the validation here by using state in the basic form. Start with validation for the individual inputs, then build your custom hook, and then start using that hook for the inputs. If you're getting stuck with that, simply go back to the previous lectures to see how we built up the validation logic and the custom hook step by step there, and then try it on your own again. Once you're done with that, continue with the next lecture, because there I will wire up this brand new form to our custom hook and then take it from there. Were you successful? I really recommend that you have a look at those last lectures again to fully understand how you manage entered values, validity, and touch state, and combine that all with different event handlers to make sure that you deliver the user experience you wanna deliver. Now here, in this case, I will continue with that finished custom hook which we built already. I will not build up that entire logic again from scratch, because I feel like I would basically just be wasting your time if I did that, because it's just what we did in the previous lectures. But I do want to apply the custom hook here one more time to really show you how you could do that in a brand new empty form. And therefore, we start by importing use input from, going up one level, hooks use input. And we then, of course, call use input here. And we call it 3 times because we have 3 inputs here. Now, the validation logic for these 3 inputs is up to you. I didn't give you any restrictions or guidance there, but it makes sense to ensure that these inputs aren't empty and that the email address is an email address. So for that, for the first 2 inputs, I'll check if the value we're getting is not empty if we trim it. And since I'll use the same function here, rather than copy and pasting it like this, I will create a new function outside of the component function, because that's not a function that needs to be rebuilt if the component is rebuilt. And I will name it isNotEmpty, store my function in this constant, and then just pass this constant here, which holds this function in the end. So this is really just the function outsourced into a separate constant. And I can do something similar for the email, isEmail. And here I get a value and check that this includes an @ symbol. And then I pass isEmail to the third use input call. Now the custom hook returns an object, as we learned, and that object is full of data which we can use. For example, it contains the value. And we might want to use the value here to be able to reset it once the form is submitted. So here, this is for my first input. I'll have the first name value. Then we get isValid, so this is first name isValid. And I'm assigning these aliases here because I'm going to extract the same keys 2 more times. So we need aliases to avoid name clashes. And here we also get the value change handler, which I'll alias with first name change handler. I get the input blur handler, which I pull out, which I alias with first name blur handler, and the reset function, which I'll alias with reset first name, like this. And then I'll copy this here, this code, and repeat this here for the second use input call. But of course here it's the last name value and the last name is valid. And here it's therefore also last name change handler and last name blur handler and reset last name. And then copy and paste it one more time for the last input, and that's the email value, and the email is valid. And here it's the email change handler and the email blur handler, and here is reset email. And now with that all done, we can go down to the JSX code, and on the first input, for example, bind our first name value. For onChange, we bind first name change handler, and for onBlur, we bind the first name blur handler like this. Then for the second input, we bind value to last name value, on change to last name change handler, and on blur, unsurprisingly, to last name blur handler. And then here for this input, I bind my value to email value, on change to the email change handler, and on blur to the email blur handler. Now, I also want to show error messages if appropriate, and I want to show different class names or add different class names, and I also want to disable the submit button if the form is invalid. So let's start with the class names and the error texts. For this, there's one other field we can extract, and that's the has error field, which I'll store in a first name has error alias. And here on the second use input call, it's last name has error. And here on the third custom hook usage, it's email has error. And it's this has error field which we can now use because now we can infer those class names, for example. Here I have my first name classes, and for that I'll take my first name has error key, and if I have an error, I'll add a class of form-control invalid, otherwise just form control, and I will repeat this error for last name classes and email classes, and here we then have the last name has error and email has error. And then here we bind our first name classes, and on the second div we bind the last name classes, and on that last div we bind the email classes. Now for the error messages, we simply go to the first input where we might need an error message like please enter a first name. And here we check if first name has error, and if that's the case, we show this paragraph, otherwise not. And I then copy that logic to the second input where I say please enter a last name, and I check for last name has error. And we copy it one more time to the email address where I check for email has error, and I say please enter a valid email address. So now that's all wired up. Now for the overall form validity, we can again derive that state. We can add a form is valid state, which initially is false. And then we check if the first name is valid and the last name is valid and the email is valid, and all three have to be valid, and only if they are all three valid, I'll set form is valid to true. If at least one of them is not valid, the form will stay invalid. So now we have the form is valid state. We can use that to disable the button, for example, to set disabled to not form is valid. If the form is not valid, the button is disabled. Last but not least, for the form submission, which I also want to add here, I'll add the onSubmit handler and then simply add a new function here. Submit handler could be the name, where I get an event. And as you learned, we call event prevent default here to prevent that browser default of sending a request. And then I check if the form is not valid. And if it's not valid, I return. And that's, by the way, new. In simple input, I didn't do that in the form submission handler. There, I was still checking for the entered name only. And that was an oversight from my side. But of course, we can't even reach that handler since the button is disabled anyways. Nonetheless, adding that extra check here might make sense because the user could theoretically enable the button with the dev tools, which of course is not really what the user should do, but it could be done. So having the extra validation step in here still also could make sense. And then thereafter, if the form is valid and we made it past this check, I will console log submitted, and then also console log my values. So the first name value, the last name value, and the email value. And then I will call reset first name, reset last name, and reset email. Now we can wire up the submit handler here, and we should be good to go. If we save everything and go back here, the button is grayed out by default. If I click in there, I get this error, and this error, and this error, and the errors are not red because I forgot to assign the right CSS class here. On these paragraphs, we should add a CSS class of error-text. So make sure you add this on the first name error paragraph and the last name paragraph and the email error paragraph. Now they are red. And of course, if I enter valid values here, then this becomes submittable. And if we open the DevTools and I click submit, I see submitted, I see the entered values, and it's reset. And again, it's working as before now. So this is looking good now, and now we applied our custom hook and what we learned to this new form as well. Now let's talk about simplifications and what else we could do. Now you could definitely try to outsource more logic. You could try to build individual input components which contain some validation logic or whatever. You could build an overall form component which handles a lot of that. You could build more custom hooks which, for example, return entirely pre-configured inputs or forms. And attached you find an article on that which might also be interesting to you, where we also build a complete use form hook which even spits out readily configured input elements which you can use in JSX. I want to focus on the basics here though, and that is already a long module. For me, it mattered to explain how we can use what we learned about React to build great user experiences and to build forms and form behaviors that make sense to our users, that feel good to our users. And at the same time, I of course also wanted to show you that this can lead to a lot of unnecessary code, and therefore building something like this custom use input hook can reduce code duplication and allows us to reuse logic. Even though we now of course still have some replicated code, but it is distinct enough, I would argue. Nonetheless, you can dive into building more elaborate custom hooks, and this attached article might be interesting for that. In addition, there also are third-party libraries that could be interesting to you. For example, Formic. Formic is a very popular third-party library for working with forms, and you can dive into the official docs to learn more about it. It's not really using hooks that much. It's more using components and patterns we know from older versions of React, so to say. But nonetheless, it's a great library when it comes to rendering forms and dealing with more complex forms and validation. Again, you can explore the official docs to learn how it works. The core idea is that you don't have to write much state management logic, but that instead you write your validation logic, you define your fields, and then let Formic do the rest. A little bit as we did it with our custom use input hook. There we also focus on passing in the validation logic, and the hook then manages the state for us. Formic then just has more use cases and outsources even more logic, or allows us to outsource even more logic to it. So that might definitely be worth a look. Now for this course though, I'm happy with this approach. You again got more practice with working with custom hooks, and you really see what's going on behind the scenes. Now you are definitely well prepared to handle forms and user input in your next projects, And of course, we are also going to work a bit more with forms in the course projects you'll find in the rest of this course. Now, as kind of a bonus, you could say, to this module, we can also practice working with useReducer again. Because what did we learn about useReducer? When does it shine, or when is it worth considering using it? We learned that it's great to use useReducer, or that it's worth a thought to use useReducer if we need more power. So if we have a lot of different possible state values and a lot of complex state updating logic, but also if we have related pieces of state which are managed in individual states, especially if those states depend on each other. Now, arguably, that's not really the case here. We neither have a lot of different state values nor a very complex state updating logic here. And in addition, we do have multiple states that kind of belong together, the value and the touched state. They both kind of represent the state of the input element, but they don't really depend on each other. That would not really be true to state this. Nonetheless, to practice working with useReducer again, I will import useReducer here now, instead of useState, and now use useReducer for managing these two state pieces here. But again, it's not strictly required, it's mainly another practice for useReducer. So I'll start by adding a reducer function, input state reducer function, we could say. And you learned that this reducer function takes two main arguments: the previous state snapshot, which will be provided and passed in automatically by React, and an action, which will also be passed into this function automatically by React, but which is the action you dispatched somewhere in your code. And then ultimately you have to return a new state snapshot here. And we can return a default state snapshot, which we always return unless we change it in code we're about to add. And that could contain our value, so the value for this input, which initially is an empty string, and the isTouched state, which initially is false. And then here in the useInput hook, we can call useReducer and pass our input state reducer function to useReducer, and also provide our initial state, which is basically this state here, and hence I'll add another constant, initial input state, which simply holds this object, and I return this object here, and I also set this here as an initial state, so the initial input state. Now, useReducer, as you learned, returns an array with exactly two elements, just like useState, and the first element is always the state managed by the reducer, so the input state as we could call it. And the second element is always a dispatch function, which allows you to dispatch actions against that reducer. So I'll name it dispatch, but you can of course pick any name you want here. Now we can get rid of these two state slices here now, and now instead start working with input state and dispatch. For example here, for validating the value, there we can now use input state dot value. We know that our input state will have a value property because that is the structure our state here will have, the state managed by this reducer. We can also get the touched state from there. Input state is touched. Now, when value change handler executes, we want to dispatch an action against our reducer, and you learned that it's totally up to you how such an action looks like, but it often is an object with a type property which identifies the action. And here I'll set type to a string called input, and it can also carry a payload, and here I'll add a value property to this object, which holds event target value as a value. And then I can get rid of this line here where we set entered value. Now we also want to dispatch in the input blur handler, and there we could use the identifier blur. And we can also provide a value here, but we're not actually interested in the value here. So there instead I can also just pass in an action like this. Now when we reset, we can dispatch an object where the type is reset, for example. Now when we return, I want to return the value, and that would be input state.value, and that is already it. With that we're good here. So now we just need to handle these three action types, input, blur, and reset, in this reducer. So we can check if action.type is equal to input, or if action type is equal to blur, or if action type is equal to reset. Now, if it is equal to input, then I want to return a new state object where I, in the end, set value to action.value. Because in the input action case here, we will have a value property on the action object, which carries the entered value. And I want to set this then. Now, I don't want to set isTouched to true, because whilst we have a keystroke, the user didn't finish typing yet. So I don't want to set isTouched to true, otherwise we would kind of break the behavior we built over this module, where we only present error messages once the user is really done. Hence here, instead I want to copy the existing state, so I will set isTouched here to state.isTouched, using the previous state's isTouched value. Now in the blur case, I want to return a new object as well. And here I want to set isTouched to true, because that is what we do when the input blurs. It should now be marked as touched. On the other hand here, I don't care about the value. We could update it, we could get it from this event object in the input blur handler, but we don't really need to do that since we're updating the value on every keystroke anyways. So hence here I can set value to state.value, simply using the existing value. And if we reset, I return an object where I set isTouched to false and value back to an empty string to reset this. And this is now our custom hook using useReducer. If you now check this again here, you still get the same behavior as before, where we can fill out the form to make it work, and where we still also get errors if we, well, have errors. So that all still works as before, but now with useReducer, simply as a little extra exercise.